Our podcast lead presenter David Bockwell has 30 years of certification assessment experience and has undertaken over 7,000 days of certification assessment. He worked full-time for BSI as operations manager for 10 years before setting up his own business carrying out independent certification assessment over the last 20 years with 19 accredited certification bodies. ISO Builder is a registered trademark of Bockwell Limited. All online content is protected by international copyright and the Trademarks Act 1994. ISO Builder Online is not responsible, liable, nor necessarily support views as expressed by our podcast presenters in any way. They are their own interpretation and views. We accept no liability for any content. Patrons should always source confirmatory opinions regarding interpretations of management systems in relation to their own situation and intended use. No content is intended to be offensive in any way.
This session is about environmental management systems. The history of environmental management systems as they are today, and how they've evolved over the last few years. Most people think of environmental management systems as ISO 14001. In fact, there are more to environmental management systems than ISO 14001. In 1996, we had the first ISO 14001. The second edition to ISO 14000 was in 2004, and currently the third edition is 2015. But prior to that, and released in 1992 by BSI and published as the world's first environmental management system standard, was BS 7750. I joined BSI as an operations manager in 1989 and stayed for 10 years looking after 20 multidisciplinary, multi-industry sector lead auditors. So I remember well in 1992 when, having spent 3 years working on ISO 9001 and the tail end of BS 5750, when BS 7750 appeared in the subject and discipline of environmental management. What we must also remember was introduced EMAS. And EMAS is short for Eco Management and Audit Scheme, predominantly used in Europe, but also in the United Kingdom as well. Now, EMAS has subtle differences to our traditional environmental management system based on ISO 14001, or fundamentally, primarily, BS 7750. And we'll explain that difference in a little while. But just to think and put in context and perspective, since then, when environmental management systems being certified to BS 7750 were at the outset, the latest data that shows from ISO survey that's available as we speak does sit around 310,000 certifications worldwide. It's interesting to look at industry sector spread of environmental certifications, and 54,000 sit worldwide in the industry of construction. The smallest area being nuclear fuel. So BS 7750 was a traditional management system standard, and although based primarily on process and procedure requirement, it was very similar to ISO 9000 series. But let's not forget, in those days, ISO 9000 wasn't simply ISO 9001. It was ISO 9001, there was ISO 9002, and there was also ISO 9003. And For simplicity, ISO 9001 was for organisations that carried out design activity. ISO 9002 was for organisations that didn't have design activity, and ISO 9003 was for those primarily involved in inspection and test. And that, in the further generations and editions, was changed to just ISO 9001 as we know it today. There was never multiple parts of BS 7750 or EMAS or ISO 14000 in the very early days, back in 1996. However, there were some things that were introduced into BS 7750 that were considered to be rather unusual when it came to the transition to ISO 14001. Such, within policy requirements for BS 7750, not only was a company expected to make its commitments, but including in those commitments, it would commit to its objectives and targets. So it was often contained within the policy statement, the organisation's actual environmental objectives and targets. And the problem that was seen with that was that this document needed to be made publicly available, and such displaying what could be considered to be weaknesses environmentally, areas which the organisation had deemed need to improve in, being made publicly. So the concern from stakeholders being that this could be used negatively by competitors. So that was removed as a part of ISO 14001 series, and simply states, and has done since, to the need to commit to the fact that there is a framework for the setting of objectives and targets and subsequent review. So thinking about ISO 14000 in structure, it's always been based on plan, do, check and act. So within the do element, setting out the stall from policy, for understanding what applicable legislation and other requirements or compliance obligation exists, the understanding of what's termed aspects, the determinants of significant aspects, objectives, the measurable element of what supports the principle of continual improvement, and environmental management performance. So, having set out the stall in plan, do is the operational control or operations element of the standard and the environmental management system. Check being the measure and monitor of the processes and reporting results. Act, to take action to improve the performance of environmental based on results that are produced. And not forgetting continual improvement, which gathers information as outputs to become inputs back into plan to improve the management system and environmental performance. So many organisations use ISO 14000 and environmental, particularly certification, to demonstrate confidence to what are now more commonly termed interested parties rather than stakeholders, and to demonstrate within the organisation good environmental management. But of course there are also requirements and expectations sometimes placed on organisations through permits and licences on site environmentally that require environmental certification. So now going back to the difference between ISO 14001 and EMAS, because some organisations would use their environmental management system certification, whether it's to EMAS or whether it's to ISO 14001, to demonstrate that point. So EMAS, the Environmental Management and Audit Scheme, was introduced to achieve a slightly different aim than a pure environmental management system. Now the first EMAS document, Eco Management and Audit Scheme, was developed in 1993, Regulation 1836, and essentially had a major requirement to produce a statement looking forward over a period of time that would be verified and challenged to ensure the organisation actually fulfills that statement. And that would typically be validated by an EMAS verifier. So I spent a number of years as an EMAS lead auditor and would carry an EMAS verifier with me on the team to carry the responsibility for verification of the statement. And that statement would go into print and would be distributed amongst what we would now call interested parties. So that's quite subtly different from your traditional environmental management system such as ISO 14001, which is today based on Annex SL, which is the same as ISO 9001 and ISO 45001. So we have the same structure, but that does not align with the requirements of the Eco Management and Audit Scheme, EMAS. So I think we've probably covered up to 2015 version, and I'm sure future editions are currently being reviewed for publication, certainly for review and consultation. But at the moment, ISO 14001-2015 clearly provides a good, strong, robust framework for the implementation of an environmental management system within an organisation, no matter what the organisation's activities are. So I think we've probably covered everything that we need to. We have a separate session on implementing ISO 14001 and some things to look out for during implementation and what makes a compliant environmental management system. This session is implementing an environmental management system against the requirements of ISO 14001-2015. So just to recap from history in previous sessions, it was in 1992 when BSI, the British Standards Institution, published BS 7750. And this was based on traditional management systems of its day, but namely ISO 9001, which provided the foundation to what became ISO 14001 Environmental Management Systems specification with guidance for use. And within the ISO 14001-2015 standard now addresses the requirements of Annex SL. Some key areas between the previous version and the 2015 standard being that there be an appreciation of internal and external elements that may influence how environmental management is conducted, a greater understanding of the needs of internal and external parties who may interact with the organisation and the environmental management system, strengthening of leadership commitment from top management, environmental management needing to be more aligned with strategic direction of the organisation. There needs to be a clearer and effective communication through communications planning, primarily driven by communications planning, and a life cycle perspective of the organisation. So really also based on plan, do, check and act, the elements of an environmental management system have evolved over time to include a breakdown as such, and then we'll go on to the typical approach for the implementation of an environmental management system. So within the plan element of plan, do, check and act, we have clause 4, context of the organisation, clause 5, leadership, 6, planning, and 7, support. And as we probably are familiar with, certainly if you've implemented quality management systems or occupational health and safety management systems, that understanding the scope of the organisation, the context within which that scope is delivered, interested parties associated with environmental management, their needs and expectations, through to determinants of risk and opportunities, is key to being what is termed as a risk-based thinking organisation. And that's something that needs to be embedded into the development of an environmental management system. No longer exists the term preventive action, which was removed out of section on non-conformity, corrective and preventive action in ACT. So we now have increased emphasis on risk-based thinking and risk planning. This isn't to be mixed with aspect evaluation and determinants of significance of aspects. Aspects being how we determine the level of interaction of the organisation on the environment and the environment on it. So, thinking about plan, we've key areas on the context of the organisation, understanding the organisation in its context, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, determination of scope, and the environmental management system. Now I'll draw attention to environmental management system in terms of clause 4.4 because that's quite an important area to consider when implementing. Insofar as ISO 14001-2015 requires organisations to determine the processes that are required to satisfy this international standard, ISO 14001-2015. So an organisation needs to establish processes that satisfy pretty much every element of the requirements of the standard. So historically we will have said, say in quality management systems, a procedure was required, which evolved to there needing to be a process to develop an understanding of the process approach. And now the same applies, but in previous editions of ISO 14000 there was limited reference to those processes needing to be documented. Now within clause 4.4 it's relatively explicit in that the organisation needs to demonstrate the processes they need to be established to ensure compliance with the requirements of this international standard. So actually you could challenge any requirement of the standard, from policy to audit to competence to environmental objectives through to continual improvement, management review, determining the scope. Is there a process? Because who, how, where and when is critical to every element of the requirements of the standard. So the second step within plan is to consider leadership commitment, environmental policy, organisational roles and responsibilities and authorities. In 6, in planning, as we've partially covered, actions to address risk and opportunities, and also aspects, and of course compliance obligation. And finally, environmental objectives and planning to achieve them. We also have in plan clause 7, support, resources, competence, awareness, communication and documented information. Documented information is an amalgamation of document control and records control, which is common as a result of Annex SL across management system standards. So trying to bundle the plan elements together is setting our stall out as a part of determinants of our environmental management system. Its structure being determined by 4.4, environmental management system, and the elements contained within 4, 5, 6 and 7 that form the basis of how our management system operates. So, thinking about understanding the context of the organisation, we need to understand the scope of what the organisation does. Boundaries are important with environmental management systems, and ring fencing, certainly if you're in pursuance of certification, is not something that is more frowned upon. So we can't take a dirty part of the site and say we want to exclude that from our certification. The intent being that we look at all our impacts internally, externally, directly and indirectly. So understanding the scope of what the environmental management system is in terms of certification is often mirrored within certificates of certification. So thinking about the site as a whole, so often what's found is an environmental scope aligns with a quality scope, which may be the design, the manufacture and the installation of X. Often the site is what's being certified for environmental management systems compliance, but that could also include implementation of the system, including installation or servicing even. So moving on to understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties is quite key, because those are the individuals that are affected by the environment and the environment on them in relation to the activities undertaken within the context within which they are carried out. So having considered our interested parties, it's important to also understand the needs and expectations of those interested parties. It's then that we look at having understood the requirements of 4.1, 4.2 and 4.3. And only then, when we have that information, and some people use pestle and SWOT, and there are other methods, to gather information together such that we can go to 6.1 to determine risk and opportunities. And usually a methodology which can be based on formal risk model international standards is used to determine our risks and opportunities. There may well be, in relation to a given interested party, multiple risks and multiple opportunities, so not to be misled by simply putting singular risks against an interested party and singular opportunities against an interested party. For me, I like to see the information horizontally, so I can work along a line from our scope to context, to interested parties, to an individual interested party, along to the related risks and opportunities that exist. And also then through the methodology have some ability to determine high and low, or most significant to least significant of risks, and most valuable opportunities to least valuable opportunities. So there's good clear visibility of how to then take the opportunity to manage and to mitigate risks and opportunities. Now this is not to be misunderstood with aspects evaluation, which has existed within all environmental management systems going back to 7750. And this is about understanding how the site and its activities on the site interact with the environment. So this is more about impacts on land and air and water, considering waste streams, considering direct and indirect environmental aspects and impacts. And that again is usually subject to a methodology that will help understand the most what are termed as significant aspects. And it's those significant aspects that move us to the area of 6.2, which is the setting of objectives, measurable objectives, and the planning to achieve them. But there's one step we've missed out, which is compliance obligation. Formerly, this was legal and other requirements. So the need for us to have process control around the identification of applicable legislation and other requirements. Other requirements being clearly defined in the annexes of the standard to things that are deemed by the organisation to be needing to comply with, but not strictly defined as legal. So it may be group requirements that are placed on the site, it may be industry requirements that are placed on the site, it may be a local environmental initiative run by a business estate or by landlords. There could be any number of areas that may be other requirements, but the intent of the standard being that those other requirements be considered in exactly the same way as if it were a piece of legislation that was applicable or deemed to be applicable on site. So that terminology, which actually runs right the way through from policy to legal management, through to operations and operational control, through to evaluation of compliance, was legal and other requirements, changed in the 2015 to compliance obligations. So that embeds the requirements within the terminology of other requirements. So thinking about environmental objectives, our focus would be, having determined our significant aspects, to ensure that they are clearly addressed within the structuring, the process of determinants of environmental objectives and their measurement. So the measurement is the terms that was previously used in environmental management systems as target. And target is key because target defines the journey that supports the principle in clause 10.2, continual improvement. So we now have clause 7, support, which identifies resource requirements, competency requirements, awareness, communication internally and externally, and documented information. So we now have within plan a bundle of processes that exist that need to be created to ensure they comply with the requirements of ISO 14001 2015 around the subject of context of the organisation, clause 4, leadership, clause 5, planning, clause 6, and support, clause 7. So we can then move on to clause 8, which is operation, and this contains the process requirements for operational planning and control. Often this is a weak area because it's not quite understood in the way in which the standard is expressing. For quality management systems, of course, this is key to have operational controls around production, around the manufacture, the actual things that you do within the organisation, within the business. So for environment, it may well be the processes around deliveries of materials, the removal of waste, the recycling. It could be any number of processes that have been determined that are the day-to-day management of environment on the site. 8.2 covers emergency preparedness and response. So in the event of something going wrong during the operational control elements, there are processes in place to ensure that those abnormal circumstances would be managed and dealt with to the best of. And one of the key areas and elements within emergency preparedness and response, and the processes that exist for that, are training and competency, but not forgetting test. So the standard calls for test of emergency preparedness and response to ensure the effectiveness of those processes that have been put in place. And one of the best areas to look for the kind of subject matter that might be subject to abnormal is to go back to your aspects evaluation. So typically our aspects evaluation through to our operational control and planning will be to determine the areas that under control conditions we need to ensure that we manage properly. So then to consider if those areas were abnormal such that 8.2 emergency preparedness and response was to be needed to be used. So I would always look for evidence that that's where we've gone back to our aspect evaluation, to look for emergency preparedness and test process control, but also suitable and effective test to ensure that in an abnormal situation we will deal with that emergency in the best possible way. We can now move on to check, which is performance and evaluation, and this section is clause 9, covering 9.1 monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation, 9.2 internal audit, 9.3 management review. So within the evaluation part of 9.1, not forgetting that's evaluation of compliance. And that carries right the way through from the determinants in clause 6.1 around compliance obligation to identify applicable legislation and other requirements, such that we can embed those obligations into our operational controls. Then when we come to evaluation of compliance within clause 9.1, processes are required to ensure that our legal obligation is being fulfilled. Now, of course, this could be carried out independently. Independently, when I say that, I mean of internal audit. It could be a process on its own, or it could actually be an element of internal audit. It could also be deemed to be, for example, through walkabouts, through monitoring and measurement, or it could be a combination of all three. The activity, of course, could also be carried out independently in terms of not necessarily from within the organisation, so taking on some organisation outside that can actually support the activity. So an external provider could be used to ensure that this activity evaluation of compliance is fulfilled. That does provide some levels of independence, but and the organisation isn't precluded from doing that, and has no requirements within the standard for, unlike internal audit, for audit of the independence of the process concerned. So that could be carried out externally and be an independent process, or carried out externally as a part of internal audit, monitoring and evaluation of compliance. Monitoring would also cover any pure monitoring requirements in terms of permits on site and expectations for compliance with permitted limits that are expected by those permits, or it could be process, or it could be license monitoring. Internal audit is pretty traditional across management systems, from quality to environment to health and safety, and expectations would be to have process control around the planning, the scoping of internal audits, and as with evaluation of compliance, the planning is quite key, such that internal audit is at the end of a given cycle demonstrating compliance for the organisation against all the requirements that are set out in the standard. Training and competency being important for evaluation of compliance and internal audit as well is not to be forgotten. 9.3 covers management review and is a strategic element of any management system. We have separate sections on management review which cover cycles and the importance of cycles, of which objectives and targets setting, policy, actions to address risks and opportunities, the determinants of risk and opportunities, compliance obligation, I think we said objectives, all being in cycles, along with evaluation of compliance monitoring, internal audit. So we cover in detail a complete separate section on management review, but that is an important step at this stage to make sure that we do in fact address that level of detail in our environmental management review. And then we go to ACT, which is improvement, clause 10, which it contains non-conformity and corrective action. So this is something where we have problems, something negative, something abnormal, and the processes that we put in place to ensure that we can manage effectively the identification of what's not non-conforming and suitable corrective action and fixes. And then finally, within clause 10.2, continual improvement, which really is closing the loop and looking for outputs from the management system, as is management review, to look for learning points and developments that we can feed back into plan, or the planning area of the environmental management system. There are key steps to implementation. There have been standards such as 855 Acorn scheme, which provided a structure for multiple stages to implement environmental management systems. And there are lots of different approaches that have been developed over time by different organisations and external bodies, consultants for example, to implement environmental management systems. But for me, I believe that a good strong understanding of the structure of an environmental management system, in fact any management system, is key, rather than creating each of those elements that I've simply run through a folder and putting something in to fulfill the requirements of the standard. It's important that we understand the process approach. It's important that we understand the requirements of clause 4.4 in determinants of processes that actually make the environmental management system and how they fit together in terms of the process approach. It's important to understand plan, do, check and act, and how your environmental management system actually operates and exists, so that it can be not just thought of as in silos, in clauses, but as an entity, as a system based on plan, do, check and act that starts with planning, with fulfillment, with checking, and then acting to improve our environmental management system. So I hope that session has helped, and we'll be running further sessions on more detailed implementation. Thank you.
ISO Builder Online, quality information for quality managers. ISO Builder is a registered trademark of Balkwell Limited. All online content is protected by international copyright and the Trademarks Act 1994. ISO Builder Online is not responsible, liable, nor necessarily support views as expressed by our podcast presenters in any way. They are their own interpretation and views. We accept no liability for any content. Patrons should always source confirmatory opinions regarding interpretations of management systems in relation to their own situation and intended use. No content is intended to be offensive in any way. Balkwell Limited, Management Systems Consultancy Audit and Training. Contact us by email, davidbalkwell@balkwellltd.com or office@balkwellltd.com. Established in 1999.